Hello. Okay. So today we're going to talk about some art that's a little bit difficult, but I think it's really good art. And I think also that now that we've been looking at painting for a while, we have some of the tools, and also we've been looking at the modernist movement. So I think we have some of the tools to understand some of the art that we're going to look at today. You know, when you look at the history of art, I think a thing that I notice with people is that you see this big change in the 20th century away from sort of representational art altogether. And it's sort of, well, what, geez, what's going on? And we've seen with the modernist movement how that sort of works out psychological. We've got this concept of phenomenology, the portrayal of subjective experience and that kind of thing, as well as other historical conceptual events that happened with French Impressionism and Post-Impressionism and modernist painting, Picasso, that we've looked at. But you get on out into the 20th century, and what happens when, after that? I mean, what happens when you've sort of blown up the conventional boundaries of representational art? What do artists do then? Well, let's take a look at some very interesting work that comes from an incredibly explosive period of artistic creation, by the way. Let me just get that up here with my little dingy dingy. And that is abstract expressionism. We are today going to look at abstract expressionist painting um, from mostly from, well, this is actually a fairly tight knit group. We're going to look at 4 painters today. All of them are associated with what used to be called the New York School. And I say here, art in the wild. Those are some color field paintings that you're looking at there by Mark Rothko. Um, that is art in the wild, art sort of let loose from the conventions of Europe. In Europe, you've always got, it's an incredibly rich cultural environment, and it's a creative cultural environment to be sure. But a difference between, let me go up here, a difference between sort of I think the European cultural environment and the environment of the Americas, and I just did this video on Latin American literature as well. There's this sort of respect for the past, which in many ways is good, but in other ways is different and has a downside in Europe, where you're sort of expected to measure up to this kind of canonical past. And sometimes it seems like I'm talking to people who are sort of part museum docents, when I'm talking to Europeans. They don't approve of stuff that's sort of not really done and not really proper. And there's still a little bit of that. I don't mean to I don't mean to be some silly America versus Europe war, but what we're talking about here is a shift from Europe being really the center to the United States. And why is that? I mean, I want to talk about that because people, again, that's something where we might get into silly stereotyping with each other. What happened was that Europe was really smashed up in World War II. And not only that, but from the middle of the 1930s on, you had terrible persecution of artists, including, of course, obviously in Germany, in Italy, in Russia, that is, in some of the countries with the most important artists, with the most important visual traditions, as well as, of course, the Nazi occupation of France. And then you had all of these intellectuals and artists who had to flee out of Europe. It wasn't just going after, say, the Jews or the gays or the Black people. Artists and painters and poets were actually definitely targeted by the Nazi regime and their allies, even as they appreciated the value of the work. So, it is true that there is indeed this big shift of the center of gravity in the art world in general, and certainly in the world of painting and sculpture, of artistic serious painting and sculpture, from Paris to New York City in the 1940s. It's not, but again, I don't think we need to get in a culture war about that. I think it's pretty clear that happened. There are a lot of structural things around World War II and the flows of intellectual people and culture money during and after World War II. And of course, the United States is now loaded with money, and Europe is flat on its back. So of course, the United States is a place where the artists are going to go. And many of these artists, except 2 of the artists we're going to look at today, are actually not born in the United States. Like Post-Impressionism, abstract expressionism really covers more of a scene where there were a lot of different things that you could do. There is a lot of commonality against among these fairly tight-knit artists that we're going to look at today. But there were really quite a lot of things. Just about anybody who was anybody from Europe or the East Coast of North America had converged on New York City at this point. As I say, anti-figurative, although a surprising number of these artists start off as figurative artists. We're still at the point, I think, with modern art in the beginning and middle of the 20th century, and I think this is true of modern poetry as well, where the best practitioners of the most modern material are people who are really, really well versed in the formal traditions and the formal tropes of the form. Obviously has to be true of the French Impressionists, but these people, it's also true of them. Many of these people start off with a serious artistic, well, serious, realistic or conventional artistic training. So, you know, I mean, I think human nature does sort of tend to gravitate towards certain directions when you're given certain types of freedom. And I think two of the things that do characterize this art is, first of all, as we've seen all through the modernist movement, a fascination with phenomenal experience and consciousness and psychology. And that's always there. There's also, though, a surprisingly large amount of spirituality to this art. And there is also an underlying kind of politics to this art. I wanted to say at the beginning, I guess while we're on this slide, I'll even step out to say it, because, you know, this is a sort of end of many years of war, and then coming into the 1950s was the Cold War period. And anybody, an artist, an actor, writer, anybody who was saying anything, for example, left wing at all, was coming under a great deal of pressure. It was a difficult time to be an artist. And you would think then that the movement into abstraction, the fact that these are abstract artists, and in the public, it's sort of a joke then and now that this art is sort of impossible to understand. It's just squiggly and googly gobble, and who knows what these pointy-headed artists are even up to anymore, and that was sort of a stereotype about it. But, you know, on the grounds that it's kind of incomprehensible. But, you know, this abstract art and the surrealist, the Dadaist art that came before it at the beginning of the 20th century, but these expressionist traditions in the middle of the 20th century really scare the hell out of the authoritarian people. All of the authoritarian types around the world think of this art as terribly decadent, bothers them more than pornography. I mean, I don't know why, but maybe it's just obvious. I mean, maybe people who are self-consciously abstracted are people who are by necessity somewhat subversive of the status quo, maybe. But I would just point out that this highly abstract art from the middle of the 20th century has been enormously sensitive political art that many governments and communities have felt really uncomfortable with. I'm not claiming to understand that, but it's a remarkable fact about this tradition. All right, so abstract not meaning then apolitical, not meaning uncontroversial. Excuse me. So let's look at the first of our four abstract expressionist painters today. Jackson Pollock. A lot of these people are called, we're going to look at action painting and color field painting, two terms that are applied to some of these abstract expressionists. Action painting, and then the idea is, remember we saw with French Impressionism, the movement from seeing the painting as representing a scene, and we saw from the middle of the 19th century on, artists and viewers really see the painting, the canvas, the frame, and the paint on the surface, the object of art itself, the exquisite object of art. That's what you have by the time you get to around 1900 in painting. Here you see sort of taking that conceptual move, maybe even a step further, in the sense of saying, well, now as an artist, I'm making this object that's supposed to be a beautiful object and an interesting object in and unto itself, quite apart from any representational function it has. But now the action painters are saying, well, what you're calling the painting is, yeah, okay, it's a painting, but it's a sort of document that was created during some kind of action. So if you want to say it's a recording of the action, that's okay. So that's the sense of action, like action rather than a thing that's being represented, maybe an action that's being represented, but not represented like you're drawing a picture of someone doing the action. You're creating the object. So that's the sort of conceptual territory that Jackson Pollock's into that. And as most people know, he would take paint cans. He used ordinary paint. He had very large canvases stretched over floors, big concrete floors, sometimes other things, as well as brushes and all kinds of other objects too, sticks and things that he would use to dribble and slop and throw and hurl the paint, instantly creating another artistic stereotype of the sort of dilettante artist throwing paint at the wall. There's a story that someone sort of disparaged what Pollock was doing in his studio one time. This very large studios, you have a very large room, quite a few yards across, because you've got a really big canvas. It's maybe 10 feet by 8 feet or 20 feet by 8 feet, something like that. So there was a door with a brass doorknob across the room, quite a ways away, and Pollock was holding a paintbrush, and he sort of flicked, and the paint went on the doorknob, 20 feet away. And he said, well, there's the door. And so of course his antagonist had to touch the doorknob, but showing his antagonist just how much he did control the paint. Anytime that you think it's not real, try and reproduce it and see if you can make it look like that. Because when you see the art like this and you think, well, gosh, anyone can do that. Well, like I say, just, okay. So you say, try to do it. Look at some really basic stuff today. It looks really basic to me. So, and Pollock even then eventually starts to number the paintings sometimes rather than, after a while, rather than give them names, because he doesn't want to put concepts onto them. Although I would argue that Jackson Pollock is a very naturalistic painter, and I always see nature a lot in his paintings. And I do like him. I think he's got such wonderful texture. It's hard to get good reproductions. Here he is, flinging. There's a famous photo session. There's lots of pictures of him throwing things and doing all sorts of things on the canvas. And as I say, I put this to give you that's a painting called Salon. This gives you some idea of the size. Literally, 20 feet long, 10 feet high. And typically these paintings, they say they're large paintings because they're trying to make an emotional impression on you. Autumn Rhythm, it's not a great reproduction of it, but I put this in. I mentioned that Picasso's Guernica was not returned to Spain until after the death of Franco on Picasso's wishes, and it used to hang on a landing in MoMA. And when I was young in the 60s and 70s, and if I went to New York City and we went to MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, I saw Guernica once or twice there while I was growing up. This painting, Autumn Rhythm by Jackson Pollock, also hangs in MoMA, and I many years ago just came across it, and it is an enormous painting. And think of sort of Van Gogh-like, paint. You can see the paint on the canvas, and it is like that. It's hard to reproduce these paintings, but this painting is special for me. Autumn Rhythm, it does have autumn colors. And rhythm, of course, the thing about what Pollock wanted was to have motion in his paintings, and they're very kinetic paintings. 1948, again, this is, after the war. They're very dense. He applies a lot. And these large ones, and then when he gets these larger spaces, larger edges in the paintings, that creates some interesting effects as well. So these enormous paintings by Jackson Pollock, these enormous drip paintings by Jackson Pollock, are the texture that, they're very sensual experiences to see. So you want to see them when you can. De Kooning, stowed away to the United States on a boat when he was 22, which of course was in 1928, long ago. And he brings with him a lot of this spirit, for example, Cubism and so on. He's starts off figuratively, and he's always sort of painting the female form like Henry Moore. And, you know, it's biomorphic shapes, people call them, mostly because they're just curved and not very linear. But always working from that into abstraction. It's interesting how many abstract painters actually are not really abstract in the sense that they don't start from anything like a pure abstraction. I'm not sure what that would even really be. I don't think even people like Mondrian do that, but maybe we'll talk about that later. De Kooning, interestingly, said it wasn't abstract at all, because what it was documenting the action, the event of making the painting. So he said, well, that's not an abstraction, that's as concrete as it can be. So that was a comment that he had. Impacting here is pushing against, so you have the idea. Remember, the Impressionists are putting up primary colors and not mixing them with each other and making them pop out of the canvas, right? So here what you have is sort of trying to subvert even that sort of notion of space, the sort of notions of space and time. And these people, as I mentioned in the other video, are also, they have pop ideas about relativism and the physics and so on. Kooning's into that. Some of his bronzes. And there he is in his studio. He actually later on has some Alzheimer's disease, and he continues to be productive. People argue about, you know, the status of the paintings that someone with Alzheimer's makes. I say it doesn't matter. But this isn't one of those paintings. This is one of the paintings, the Exodus Prime, interchange, a lot of motion, a lot of exploration of space. And taking these, he has a whole series of these women paintings, taking the female form out into abstraction, like, as I mentioned, like the sculptor Henry Moore. They're really quite entertaining paintings, and it's the classic example, isn't it? You tell me, is it not the classic example of something where you say, well, gee, you ought to be able to put something together like that without too much trouble. How does it create that effect? You know, it's a handling of color, a handling of light. Notice you do have to think about all the way that all the colors and the tones of the colors and your hues and your light, it doesn't make any difference whether you're painting abstract or figuratively in that sense. And here you can see really maybe a little more actual Cubist influence in using that hatching to explore the space. Kooning, Rothko. Color field paintings, which are as they sound. They function by creating an environment with a large surface of color, and then things happen with other areas of color in this larger environment of color. You sort of think of like maybe in a Saturday morning kids cartoon. So you're off in a world, somehow something happens to, you know, Mordecai and Rigby, and they're in like an orange world, and then everything's orange in the space that they're in. And then what happens if like a big pulsing sort of purple square thing kind of passes through? What'll that do to the light? Because the color field theorist doesn't want you to sort of step back. They kind of want you to step in. They kind of want you to get into, they're trying to create a sort of environment, and you get into the color. And really, people would, you know, criticize it, but the idea was really using the color, you know, really sort of surrendering to the color in a sense. Rothko, who makes these color field paintings, if you don't know what they look like, I'm going to show you in a second, don't worry, is this very spiritual person. And he's also got a lot of anger because of the persecution of the Jews in general, and the story of his own family. He had a rough time before he ended up in the United States. And he seems, you know, he seems like Van Gogh in the sense, you know, Van Gogh would say he would choose some of his colors because the colors were felt like they sounded certain ways. Synesthesia, that is, you know, hearing sounds or tasting textures. And Rothko, I think, when you listen to him talk about what he's trying to achieve, he's really trying to express emotions the way sort of Beethoven thinks, well, different notes and different chords kind of cause different emotions. So maybe I can have sort of a catalog of that, and then I can sort of make I can make a technique of that. And Rothko's kind of thinking that with color, that colors put people into moods, and maybe he can kind of, you know, that's what he's working with. Well, he starts off as a kind of surrealist mythical painter. As I say, Rothko has sort of three. How do you get, you know, this is the thing, you think color field, you know, does he really have to be technically proficient to get to that? And I think the answer is yes. And he has these interesting early, he likes these layers. He likes this composition, sort of like a Baroque composition, like a Velázquez, where he's got his sort of 4 layers. He's even got the ceiling up there, like in Las Meninas. And then something that looks like Juan Miró or Dali, something that's surrealistic. This big painting. And then we see him. And the other thing is, notice is after the war and what's sort of happening to artists after the war and what they're thinking about. And he's thinking about color. He's still it's still figurative, but now he's sort of moving off into color in the same way that maybe Picasso's moving off into facets of a surface. He's moving off into the color and becoming increasingly abstract, but the direction that he's moving in is just being interested in what color does. And again, he wants to get something really elemental. He wants, in fact, to express sort of the tragedy of existence. He wants to express, you know, really sort of heavy things. And he thinks the only way to do it is abstractly. They're difficult to preserve because they age, and also if they're exposed to light. And of course, they're all about the color. So preservation of these paintings is a challenge. They're big canvases. And if you step into them, like he wants you to do, and you see kind of the way, and you get the energy again, energy coming out of it. It's doing something, putting the colors together, and they're doing something. And so the idea is to have that immersive experience. And, you know, the painting isn't representing anything at all. It's expressing things. So Mark Rothko, I mean, a deeply spiritual painter, actually, when you look at him. Finally, Franz Klein, had to do Franz Klein. You know, because he's a bit of a challenge. He actually, Franz Klein, not from Europe. In fact, he grew up in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, in coal country. And when you see these big black and white shapes that he has, one of his inspirations is sort of locomotives and steel mills and things. Something you wouldn't necessarily know, to be sure, if you know that didn't come out. And these are also figurative. He started figurative. One way to think about it is if you have a coherent picture and then you sort of look at one part of it. And so you can look at these black and white pictures of his as sort of suggesting details of a larger world. Moving into spatial experience. And so Klein also is considered to be a forerunner of minimalism, that he is getting down to a minimalist concept in what he's doing. In terms of whether he's an action painter, it looks like he's an action painter because it looks like somebody's got like a really big brush, which sometimes they just do, and there it is, like Japanese calligraphy, right? Like you've just got sort of muscle memory from the practice, and you know, that kind of thing. So that sounds action, right? But Rothko said he set the canvases up the way he did because he actually wanted to involve the viewers and draw the viewers in. He didn't want people to, that is to say, look and appreciated his motion. He wanted people to interact with the painting. And somehow there's a real sense of motion, and getting into that sense of motion is one of the things that's sort of interesting about these paintings. course, he starts off, this is where he comes from, coal country, as I say. This was actually commissioned by his hometown, and they liked this painting when he was very young. And then he starts to move into abstraction. Here you can see sort of industrial forms. Now, Nijinsky is a famous Russian ballet dancer, and he's doing pictures of Nijinsky. And so just to show you the direction and to get you into his abstraction. So here's some studies of Nijinsky that he's doing, 1947, 1948. And compare that to Picasso. You see the same kind of thing in Picasso when you understand that you are looking at a form. And then you can see it, and you can see that the artist is starting with the form and moving out from it. And in this painting of Nijinsky from 1950, you can see Kline doing that. And so he has a long series of these. And you can also, I think, see why people think this is a precursor to minimalism. They don't look like that with that fuzz. That's a difficulty of reproduction. They're more looking like, as I say, calligraphic, Asian inked in person. Okay, and then he does get back to color finally after 5 or 6 years of this, and then he decides, okay, he'll get back, and again, you can see this kind of, so it's so interesting the way the really abstract artists of the middle of the century somehow managed to convey quality. And I'm interested in these art critics who can tell you, well, this one's a really important one. I can see it with Picasso, some of the Picasso ones. But you have to give up some skepticism, but not too much. And yeah, naturalistic. And again, that sense of motion, always a sense of action in all of these painters. That's a big part of not being representational, is that you want to be kinetic. Okay. So abstract expressionist art from the middle of the 20th century, often misunderstood, often the object of humor, and sure, doesn't have to take itself too seriously either. But I think you can see that there are historical currents, artistic currents that are pulling these artists along. And something that's really interesting about that is if you think of that as kind of collective, and you think of the artist as an extension of sort of the national collective, and then you see what was happening in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s in art in the United States. Very exciting period. Nothing, I don't think, like that happening now. Although maybe I'm just a nudge. I don't get the forms. I better stop talking. I'm not gonna start talking about the bands that I like. Oh my God. I turn it off. There we go. I don't know.